Everybody has a story. Everybody's story matters to God. Nobody gets the story they wanted. What I want to talk to you about for a few minutes today is, what do you do when your story gets interrupted? What do you do when the story that you thought was going to be your story is no longer available to you, and it is quite clear that it will never be available to you? And then when another story that you never wanted to be your story will inexorably be, what do you do then? Because the truth is, on the one hand, we're all writing our stories, but none of us is in charge of our stories. I have the agency to be able to decide how I will respond to life and how I will take action and what I'm able to create and innovate, but I am not God. I don't get to decide my story. And yet somehow in partnering with God, in surrendering to God with a full, active, initiative-taking, deeply God-trusting approach to life, it is possible to enter into, to connect my broken story with a larger story that has the hope of redemption. What I want to do during these moments, and if you're still living the story that you always wanted, this may not be for you today, but I want to tell you the story of a young woman you may or may not know about. Her name is Etty Hillesum. And this is from Richard Lisher's book, Our Hearts Are Restless. It's a chapter called The Radiance of a Yellow Star. As of April 29, 1942, all Dutch Jews are required to wear a yellow star on their outer garment, the quote-unquote Jew star. It is an ancient practice in Europe, mandated by the Pope in the 13th century, and maintained in some form by civil and religious authorities until the 18th century, when Frederick William I of Prussia abolished the practice for anyone who could pay approximately $75,000 in current money. Now, near the midpoint of the 20th century, that old requirement has found a young woman who lives in South Amsterdam. Her name is Etty Hillesum. For nearly 6 months, she's been keeping a diary in which she records the most intimate details of her inner life, her friendships, her loves, the worsening social and political situation in Holland. The vitality of her personality is mirrored in the vitality of her writing, which, in its honesty, vividness, and occasional poetry, is unmatched among modern memoirs. Like some memoirs, her diary is addressed to herself, but as her destiny clarifies itself, we are not in charge of our stories. It is increasingly directed to God and toward us, her imagined posterity. At some point before she is transported to Auschwitz, she entrusts her diary to a close friend and housemate. Her diary will not come to public view until it is published in 1981, and then eventually translated into English and a number of other languages as An Uninterrupted Life. She writes in her diary, where she takes as part of her mission in life, because she's a very gifted writer, to notice, to see people, sometimes people wearing the yellow star, and has a vision of golden radiance of seeing the dignity and the worth of that person and recording it. If I forget you, Jerusalem, the psalmist says, may my right hand lose its cunning. And she takes unto herself the ministry of not forgetting. On the day when she writes one of the most powerful of these kind of visions, she also writes these words, never give up. Now this may be God's word to you today. Never give up. Never escape. Take everything in, and perhaps suffer. That's not too awful either. But never, never give up. Lucia goes on to write, how does one calculate the power of one's story to move the world? Whenever the unspeakable occurs, story speaks an audible blessing over those who are forgotten. It proclaims from the housetop what has been hidden in dark rooms and torture chambers. Eddie makes a promise to herself and the world. I shall wield this slender fountain pen as if it were a hammer, and my words will have to be so many hammer strokes with which to beat out the story of our fate. Her country, Holland, is taken over by the Nazis, and she begins to read the Psalms and the Old Testament and Augustine and the Gospel of Matthew, and begins to find God, the living God. She does it all the wrong way. She is taught how to pray by two men, both of whom are her lovers. Now, that can't work. And when I read about that, and then you read some of her prayers, they will just make you weep. And I realize God worked with people like David, is called a man's after God's own heart in the Old Testament, although his sex life was a train wreck. And knowing that doesn't make me want to be any less faithful, any less faithful, or to change my practice. But it does make me a little less judgmental and a little less open to the fact that God may be at work in everybody in ways that transcends the categories and little boxes that I choose. From her first faltering impulse to kneel on the mat in her bathroom, she finds a place for kneeling everywhere in her house. Eventually, she will find it in the barracks of a detention camp, because that's where she ends up. She could have sought to escape from the Nazis, and many of her friends try to get her to do this. But something inside her, as she is moving towards God, impels her not to do this, but to identify with people. And she volunteers to go from Amsterdam to Westerbork, which is a kind of a Nazi transit center, over and over and over to be with people. She styles herself the girl who learned to pray and plans to write a story about it. From a Nazi transit camp, her confession merges with Psalm 63. The psalmist writes, "My soul is satisfied as with a rich feast, and my mouth praises you with joyful lips when I think of you on my bed and meditate on you in the watches of my night." And then here's her response to God to that psalm. "You have made me so rich, O God. Please let me share out your beauty with open hands." This from a Nazi transit camp. "My life has become an uninterrupted dialogue with you, God, one great dialogue. Sometimes when I stand in some corner of the camp, my feet planted on your earth, my eyes raised toward your heaven, tears run down my face, tears of deep emotion and gratitude. At night, too, when I lie on my bed and rest in you, O God, tears of gratitude run down my face, and that is my prayer." Most of her prayers are prayers of adoration, and she does not pray for herself, but for others. Ultimately, at her lowest points, she asks that her life become a prayer. This is a real person who, again, died in obscurity, and her words did not come to light until decades after her life was over. Her desire to be of help to God causes her to be of help to people. She sees a young paralyzed girl with enormous eyes who is having a hard time dying and helps her to die. She smuggles food to people, or clothes to people, or medicine to people, or stands by people to pray for them. She sees it all and takes it all in so that she can also feel it for people. She calls herself the thinking heart of the barracks. The last sentence of her diary reads, "We should be willing to act as a balm for all wounds." After her 12th return to Westerbork, Eddie Hillesum, her parents, and her two brothers were unexpectedly selected themselves for transport to Auschwitz. In the disheveled scramble to collect a few things for the journey, they were separated into different wagons. In haste, Eddie scribbled a postcard and tossed it from the window of a moving train, her final words. It said, "Opening the Bible at random, I find this. The Lord is my high tower. And then, in a last ecstatic gesture of what can only be guessed at, she adds, we left the camp singing. We left the camp to be sent to Auschwitz singing. It is her letter to the world. A farmer found it and mailed it to the Amsterdam address. There are no further postcards from hell. Her parents died on the journey to camp, or were gassed upon their arrival. Her brother Misha died in Auschwitz. Her brother Jacob survived the liberation of the camp, but died on the journey back to Amsterdam. Eddie Hillesum died at Auschwitz on November 30th, 1943. Such a person lived and walked in hell on earth with God. That was her story. Everybody has a story. Our stories often get interrupted, but they are never beyond the reach of God. You are never beyond the reach of God today, whatever your story and however it has been interrupted. Never, 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 never give up.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any future teachings from John Ortberg here at Become New. My name's Tim, and I'm a part of the team here. This series is all about stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story matters. And we want to know about your story, whether it's a story of coming to faith or a story of spiritual growth. Whatever it is, we're here for you. You can email that to us at connect@becomenew.com, or you can text it to us. You can also sign up for daily reminders whenever we drop a new video via text by texting the word BECOME to the number 855-888-0444. You can also send us prayer requests there. There's a team of us that meet to pray each weekday for viewers just like yourself. If you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video, be sure to check that out at becomenew.com/subscribe. More than a video to watch, this is really a community to belong to, and we're so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you next time.